Hello my beautiful music makers. In today's video we're going to go over what a bus is in the mixing process, why you would utilize it, what advantages it brings you, and any confusion that might arise from other terminology like auxiliaries and auxes and buses and master bus. What does it all come together to mean? So in music production and mixing, a bus is a channel where multiple other channels can all come together to a single source. For example, if you've got all of your different drums, we can send them all to a bus and they all combine together at the drum bus. These exist both in your large format mixing consoles and they exist within your DAW. Whichever format you're working on, the theory is the same, and you'll often find that mixers, engineers, producers reserve a section of their mixer space for the use of buses. Now in our context, buses and auxiliaries, usually referred to as an aux channel, are related but serve a different purpose. An auxiliary will generally be used to apply an effect to a particular send without placing it directly on that channel. A key example of this may be a reverb on something like the snare, where we don't want to place it directly on the snare channel. We have a separate auxiliary with the reverb effect on. And then we use an auxiliary send from our channel where our snare sits to send to the reverb. The benefit of doing it this way is it means we can then send our hi-hats, cymbals, vocals, all to that same reverb that has been set up. And using the auxiliary sends, we can send different amounts, so different volume levels of each of those channels to that effect. This is far more effective than placing that same reverb, for example, across each of those individual channels, and it allows us to have one reverb with one setting in one location where we can have the same space being created. Reverb isn't the only thing we would do with this, so let's jump into Logic and I'll show you an example of how I've used an auxiliary on a recent track. Okay, so for an example, let's look in this track here at what an auxiliary would be compared to a bus. If we have a look at this channel here, it's yellow, it's got capitals on it, it's called wide aux. This is set up as an auxiliary and I use it to make a wide effect happen on certain sounds when I want it to happen. And it happens on some vocal sections right here, so we can play this part here. So when I play this, we're going to get a nice wide spread on the vocals using this auxiliary. And let's solo it out. That's what it's doing. If you're listening in headphones, it should push everything right to the sides and kind of sit behind you a little bit. And then the actual vocal sits in the middle at the front. Now the difference between a bus and an auxiliary is that I've got control of the level to that send. So we can see here on this ELB mix part, we've got B10, and B10 is my auxiliary to the wide aux, and I can control the amount of volume going in there. If I hold Option and click, it's now going to go full send in there. We can dial it back, and it's controlled via this auxiliary volume control. Now a bus, as described earlier, doesn't typically have its own audio source. Instead, we take different channels and different audio sources and send them all to the bus. Without those audio sources, the bus will always be an empty channel with no audio being produced. So both buses and auxes are used in a utility way for grouping signals and sending them to a particular place. If we think for an auxiliary, it's so we can affect that signal and then choose the balance of how much of that signal is going to the effect without adjusting the overall balance of your mix. Let's jump back into Logic and we'll have a look at the drums in this track and see how that actually I've bussed two parts together and then combined more sounds and then sent those into a second bus for further processing and control. And we'll look at the benefits of doing that and working that way. So here's a couple of things we can do with bussing a group of sounds together that you can't do when they're all individual, and the benefits of it essentially. So we've got a track stack up the top here with the chopped up break. So all of this Now all of these that are now highlighted are then routed into another bus called drums over here. There's this main bus here, and there's our brake. Technically, the chopped up brake here is also on the bus. In Logic over here, you have this little arrow down the bottom here, and we can open it up and you can see there's actually some effects and other processing going on different parts of the brake inside here, which then comes to this bus here, which has got a channel EQ, which allows me to do some filtering and processing on just that drum brake. It helps me get this little effect that happens at the end here, without affecting the other drums. And I can compress the brake separately, and then that's all bussed into another bus. So there's an example there straight away where, you know, we've got all of these individual drums, but I've got these chopped up parts of brakes, and there's two brakes in here connected together and mashed into the one. If we sew that out to make this here, we wanted to be able to like EQ and filter that out, so there's automation running on that as well. You can see here, it comes back in at the end. But I still wanted my sharp snare, the shaker loop and everything to remain unaffected. So it's all bussed together so that we can do that. So all of this can remain untouched when this filters out. And then all of the drum brakes, so everything goes into the drums bus over here, and that has more processing on it to bring everything together and to feel like it's this one big individualized drum brake, right? I don't want it to feel like it's two brakes chopped together and then my snare sample and then bit of a shaker loop under the snares. But we see we can open up the two plugins that are on here, and then we've got bulk processing going on these as well. And it's just a little bit of compression here, specifically controlling this area. I think this helps the snare pop out, but controls it at certain times as well. And we've just got a bit of a lift and actually a fade off on the high end, which you probably don't see all that often, but there was too much high end with everything layered together, too much air going on. Just a nice little gentle roll off there. And we can do it and shape the whole brake that way as well. There you can see the control happening where I've lifted up at 1K, but when the snare's in, it pulls it back. So we can have that boost, but when the snare was making it a little bit too much, you know, we just pull that back. And it doesn't always happen because we switch brakes at different parts of the track and do bits like that where we still want the lift to be in as well. And hopefully by now you've realized that there is a bus that is always in effect, and this is why it's referred to as the 2 bus, and it's your stereo out. Every single track and auxiliary you create inside your session gets bussed to the 2 bus, and this is where mastering essentially happens. That left and right stereo channel, which is a sum of everything else, is your master bus. So that has been a breakdown of the terminology, uses and benefits of working with buses, as well as hopefully taking away any of the misconceptions about auxes and buses being the same thing. I really hope it's been helpful for you, and I look forward to seeing you in future videos. Take care.